Iceland under the Norse. An unknown island. The island of Iceland lies almost exactly 1,200 kilometers away from northern Scotland at the shortest distance as the crow flies. That is considerably less than twice the distance between the cities of Milan and Naples in Italy, and only slightly more than the distance between Paris and Barcelona. And yet, while Iceland is comparatively quite close to other parts of Europe, amongst the world's large islands and island chains, it is the third last to have remained uninhabited. It seems almost certain from archaeological evidence and other data that all through the era of the building of the Egyptian pyramids, the development of complex agricultural societies and urban civilizations in large parts of Eurasia, the development of ancient Greece, and the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, Iceland remained uninhabited by humans. Indeed, so isolated was it that virtually nothing else lived here either. Though the air above it and the seas around it teemed with birds and sea creatures, the island itself was home to a very thin smattering of land mammals, the Arctic fox being a rare feature of life here. A few intrepid explorers from the ancient Mediterranean, most notably Pytheas of Massalia, who wrote about a mysterious island called Thule in the North Atlantic, might have briefly arrived to the island. Irish mariners of the 7th century also possibly arrive here, but it was not until the late 9th century that human beings finally arrived and properly settled on Iceland in significant numbers. Amongst the world's large islands and island chains, only Madagascar and New Zealand remained uninhabited by humans for so long. When Iceland was finally settled, it was so by Norse colonists from Scandinavia. There was soon a golden age of Norse culture underway on this, one of the world's remotest islands. The Norse Age and the settling of Iceland. It is not 100% clear when Iceland was first settled. We know with virtual certainty that it occurred in the second half of the 9th century. There are competing narratives and interpretations concerning the specifics of this settlement process. Archaeological evidence reveals a certain set of information, while there are also numerous Norse sagas and histories that shed light on the topic that were written in the 12th and 13th centuries, during the golden age of Norse culture on Iceland, a topic to which we'll soon return. One of these, for instance, is the Illendingabók, meaning the Book of Iceland, a history of Iceland written by an Icelandic priest and scholar, Are Bogelson, in the early 12th century. The Illendingabók starts with a section on the settlement of Iceland by Norse explorers during the long reign of King Harald I of Norway, who ruled for over half a century between around 872 and 930. It was during the first years of his reign that Ingolfur Arnason, a Viking explorer from western Norway, led a band of his followers to Iceland and is understood to have settled in the southwest of the island, near what is now the capital city, Reykjavik. While the view of Arnason as the founder of the first Norse colony on Iceland is the most widely accepted interpretation, there are competing theories based on other chronicles. Another Norse text, the Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, provides a number of different theories. It holds that a Norse figure by the name of Nadoda was the first to land on Iceland around 850 and named it Snaeland, the land of snow, before a further explorer, Gardar Svavarsson, came to the island around 860, circumnavigated it, and built a house on the northern side of the island. Perhaps all of these tales are true, with figures like Nadoda and Svavarsson exploring the island tentatively in the 850s and 860s before Arnason and his group arrived to establish a more substantial colony in the 870 EEs. Over time, more and more Norse arrived, and by around the year 930, when King Harald died in Norway after a long reign, the settler population on Iceland is believed, based on the Islendingabok, to have been inhabited by about 3,500 people living dispersed on over 1,000 farms. DNA studies and more scientific work has determined that the blood strains of these early settlers were actually more in line with Celtic inhabitants from Ireland, northern Britain, and the Scottish Islands, which might indicate that people from Ireland and Scotland began settling here quickly after the first settlements were established by the Norse, or that a large number of slaves from Ireland and Scotland were being traded to the Norse of Iceland. The population would continue to grow into the tens of thousands in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, but it never ballooned to a large size. Remember, Iceland's population even today is only around 400,000 people, and this cold, volcanic island has always been thinly inhabited, with most people living in the slightly more hospitable coastal regions of the south and southwest. The Commonwealth of Norse Iceland. One of the unique things about Iceland, and something which allowed a golden age to develop here in the centuries after it was settled, is that Iceland did not become the dominion of a king or individual warlord. This is what happened almost everywhere the Norse went. For instance, the Danes and Norwegians who conquered large parts of Ireland and Britain in the 9th and 10th centuries soon established themselves into various kingdoms, like the Kingdom of East Anglia, the Kingdom of Dublin, and the Kingdom of Northumbria. This didn't occur in Iceland. Instead, around the year 930, by which time the island had been sufficiently populated that a government of some kind was needed to mediate relations between the Norse colonies there, a commonwealth was set up in which the leaders of the small Norse communities that dotted the island met in a parliament to discuss issues of mutual concern. The parliament was known as the Althing, the name which the Icelandic parliament holds down to the present day. It was an assembly, or Thingvellir, that took place in an open field assembly about 30 miles to the west of modern-day Reykjavik. Here, the leading men of the island would meet in an open assembly field and deliberate on matters which pertain to the island. If disputes needed to be resolved between individuals or a response to foreign interference needed to be decided on, then it was discussed at the Althing and agreements were reached. This commonwealth system, a kind of Norse democracy, would prevail for nearly 3.5 centuries and facilitated the development of the Icelandic Golden Age. It helped too that Iceland was simply out of the way and not particularly rich, factors which ensured that the island was not invaded by grasping foreigners. Instead, its thousands of Norse homesteaders farmed and fished and lived a quiet but relatively prosperous life on their remote island home, Iceland, Greenland, and America. One of the great achievements of the Norse culture that emerged on Iceland during this period was the discovery of the Americas. The adventurous spirit of exploration and discovery which had led explorers like Nadoda and Ingolfur Arnason to discover Iceland in the first place never left the Icelanders, and in the 980s several individuals from the island set off to discover new lands. The chief figure involved was Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Erik the Red. He was actually born in Rogaland in southwestern Norway, though his father was banished from there when Erik was still young, and the family relocated to Iceland. This occurred in the early 960s when Erik was a child of around 10 years. He grew up on Iceland and lived there for much of his adult years. Unfortunately, though, the son took after the father, and in 982 Erik, who acquired his descriptor name the Red based on the color of his beard, killed several of his neighbors in a dispute that had arisen over a landslide that workers on Erik's farm were alleged to have caused. At a local assembly to adjudicate on the matter, it was determined that Erik and several of his followers would be banished from Iceland for a period of no less than 3 years. It might have been expected that the small band would sail for somewhere like Ireland, Scotland, Norway, or even Normandy in northern France or the Faroe Islands, which were all part of the growing Norse world in the North Sea at that point. But instead, they sailed westwards for Greenland. It is a common misconception that they were heading off into the unknown. In reality, the Norse knew by this time that there was a land of some kind here, as earlier explorers had stumbled upon it in previous voyages. But Erik the Red would be the first person to establish an actual Norse settlement on Greenland. They arrived there not long after being exiled from Iceland in 982. Hence did colonists from Iceland establish the first European settlement on Greenland, theoretically part of the Americas. While in due course, the Greenland settlements would lead to the discovery of Canada for the first time by European explorers. Erik and his followers returned to Iceland in 985 when their 3-year period of enforced exile was complete. They brought with them news of the mysterious land to the west, which they had explored more fully. Aware of the need to promote the new land if he wished to become ruler of a successful colony there, Erik christened it as Greenland, giving the impression of a warmer, temperate region where people could engage in agriculture more easily than on Iceland. A large expedition of 24 ships set off for Greenland under his command not long afterwards. In the years that followed, 3 separate colonies were established on the shores of Greenland, imaginatively named as the Western Settlement, Eastern Settlement, and Middle Settlement. Over time, these grew considerably along the coastal regions named Eriksfjord, in large part because valuable materials like walrus ivory, whale oil, and sealskin could be acquired here. Erik died in the first years of the 11th century and was succeeded by his son, Leif Erikson. By then, Leif had already led an expedition to what the Norse termed Vinland, but which we call Newfoundland in northeastern Canada. The name possibly derives from the Latin for wine, and may be a reflection of Leif and his followers finding wild grapes growing here. They established a colony here, the first European settlement in Canada. However, the Norse colony here did not last long and was eventually abandoned. Those on Greenland survived for hundreds of years, only being abandoned in the 14th and 15th centuries, possibly as a result of societal decline in Europe brought on by the Black Death. What's important to bear in mind is that these first extensive European contacts and settlement in the Americas were a direct byproduct of Norse settlement on Iceland. Christianity arrives. By the time Erik the Red was establishing the first colonies on Greenland, a major development was occurring on Iceland. Christianity arrived to the island in the last quarter of the century. When the Norse Age began, and the Vikings and Danes began spreading out to places like England, Ireland, and northern France, and the Swedes voyaged down the great rivers of Eastern Europe to Ukraine, the Norse were still pagans who worshipped a pantheon of Germanic gods like Odin and Thor. As powerful as the Norse people proved in conquering new lands, they were soon won over to the religion of their new subjects. The first recorded instance of a Norse warlord converting to Christianity comes from as early as 826, when a Danish king, Harald Klak, agreed to convert in order to acquire an alliance with Louis the Pious, king of the Franks. By the end of the 9th century, many Norse rulers were converting in places like England, some out of genuine belief, some for political reasons, many for a combination of the two. So advanced was Christianity amongst the Norse by the middle of the 10th century that missionaries began arriving to Iceland to try and convert the settlers here. They met with limited success at first, but in the final years of the first millennium, an assembly was held of the Althing, and it was agreed that the islanders would begin converting. By the middle of the 11th century, a bishop of Iceland had been appointed, and by 1100, the inhabitants were almost universally Christians, living in 2 dioceses of the Church. Norse culture on Iceland. Iceland might have been thinly populated in Norse times, but it punched far above its weight during this era in terms of its contribution to the wider Norse culture of the North Sea and North Atlantic. Quite simply, were it not for the work which was done by a number of scholars on Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, we would know far less about the culture and beliefs of the people who emanated out of Scandinavia to conquer large parts of Europe from the late 8th century onwards. We have already touched on a number of the works involved. One was the Islandingabok, the Book of Icelanders, which, as we have seen, already began with discussion of how Iceland was first settled by Norse explorers in the second half of the 9th century. It then went on to provide an extensive commentary on the history of Iceland and how Icelandic explorers contributed to the discovery of Greenland and Newfoundland, as well as exploring the Christianization of the island. In the process, the Islandingabok also provided a wealth of information on how Norse law functioned and detailed genealogies of some of the most important Norse families of Norway, Iceland, and other regions. This was just one specimen of the literature produced on Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries. There were many others. An entire genre of poetry, for instance, is broadly associated with Iceland. Although the skald, a Norse term meaning rhyme, first emerged in Norway in the 8th and 9th centuries, it was in Iceland many centuries later that these poems reached the peak of their popularity and sophistication. Many of them tell the stories of Norse kings and explorers and their deeds. Other pieces of Icelandic literature are prose epics such as the Laxdæla Saga, transliterating as the Sage of the People of Laxardalr. Written in the 13th century, it relates the story of a number of close friends living in western Iceland in an earlier era when Iceland was first being settled. They quarrel over a young woman each is courting and over whom they fall out, leading eventually to death and vengeance. The Njal Saga, also written in the 13th century and again set in the 10th century early on in Iceland's Golden Age, tells the story of a warrior named Njal the Burner. It revolves around a blood feud between Njal and his family with another family and sheds a lot of light on how Norse honor systems operated. The overall impression we get from these is that Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, despite being a thinly populated, relatively inhospitable land on the periphery of Europe, seemed to be an island on which someone in every farmstead or hamlet seemed to be writing a saga, history, or poem of one kind or another. It was a golden age of Norse culture here on Iceland. Snorri Sturluson. As extensive and complex as these works were, they all stand in the shadow of the writings of the leading literary figure of the Icelandic Golden Age. This was Snorri Sturluson. He was born on Iceland in 1179, the son of a powerful lord of the Sturlungar clan. Growing up amongst the local courts of the Icelandic nobility, he acquired an interest in Norse poetry from a young age. He consequently spent much of his adult life as both a significant politician, one who served twice as the Speaker of the Icelandic Althing, and as a scholar of considerable renown. He composed poems, wrote histories, and compiled chronicles. By far, his most esteemed work is one of the classics of Norse literature, one which provides an immense amount of information about Norse mythology and lore that would otherwise not have survived had Sturluson not recorded it. This is known as the Prose Edda. The Edda contains many of the stories concerning the Norse deities, such as Odin, Thor, and Loki. It is from it that some of the accounts of Ragnarok, the war which occurs at the end of days in Norse mythology, are derived. Sturluson's versions have informed all modern accounts of Norse mythology, from Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle in the 19th century to Marvel's movies in the early 21st century. End of the Golden Age. Sturluson was writing just as the Golden Age of Norse culture on Iceland was about to come to an end. He died in 1241, assassinated by some accounts by agents of the King of Norway. 2 decades later, in 1262, the independence which Iceland had broadly enjoyed since it was first settled nearly 400 years earlier began to come to an end. Back on the Norse mainland, a civil war had raged in Norway early in the 13th century. Håkon IV had emerged from it as king of a unified state in the 1240s, and he soon became one of the most powerful Norse rulers Europe had ever seen, marrying his children into royal houses all over the continent, even as far away as Spain. As part of his diplomatic initiative, in 1262, he managed to get the Icelandic lords to agree to the Gissurasáttmáli. This means Gisur's covenant, named after the Icelandic chieftain Gissur Thorvaldsson, who negotiated it, though it is usually referred to simply as the Old Covenant. Under its terms, the Icelandic Commonwealth came to an end, and Iceland moved towards political union with Norway, with the kings of Norway also acknowledged as kings of Iceland. This brought to an end the political independence of Iceland, and in due course, in 1397, Iceland was subjugated into a Scandinavia union of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden under the terms of the Union of Kalmar. As it lost its political independence, Iceland's golden age came to an abrupt end. The literary output of the island, which had characterized the 12th and 13th centuries, collapsed in the 14th. Still, it had been a remarkable period here for a time in the High Middle Ages, when Iceland became the center of a vital culture. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to show your support, and watch more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. We'll see you in the